author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
President Joe Biden delivered his second State of the Union speech last week, the first to a fractured Congress. But what was his message? Did he make the grade? And ultimately, what was the real driver behind his haphazard rhetoric? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we have the designated Liberty Nation State of the Union panel to dissect and decode what really went down. I'd like to say a special thank you to our listeners on KACT on 1360 AM out of Andrews, Texas. Thanks for being part of the team. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. The question of a unifying theme in Biden's State of the Union has the nation scratching its collective head. Was the scattergun approach to topics without an overarching motif all part and parcel of a grander plan for President Biden? Well, we're fortunate to be joined by our special Liberty Nation panel of senior political analyst and longtime host of this here show, Mr. Tim Donner, chief political correspondent and satirist, Graham J. Noble, and legal affairs editor and host of the Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. We must add the Esquire there just to get your qualifications in, Scott, and we do appreciate it. I'm sure Dr. Jill
took a number
Biden
of years
too.
to get those, a year for each letter, I think.
It's the SQs like the doctor in Dr. Jill Biden.
No, it's
Absolutely.
Definitely not, Tim. It's nothing like that at all, as a matter of fact.
Well, as Whoopi Goldberg says, she should be Surgeon General of the United States.
Mhm.
So, gents, we all suffered last night or early this morning watching the State of the Union. Overall impressions, did it land or not? What do you think, guys?
Well, you know, in my opinion, it was a typical State of the Union in the sense that it was just a laundry list of everything that they have accomplished, using air quotes, which involves reaching into taxpayer pockets and borrowing money to the tune of a 31 trillion plus national debt. That's 31 followed by not 3 or 6 or 9, but 12 zeros. I like to make that point from time to time. But, you know, it's always possible for a president to craft a message that makes it sound like he's George Washington, Abe Lincoln, FDR, and Reagan rolled into one. But, you know, he tried to do it again. And I actually thought in the first half of the speech, it was interesting if you listened closely. He was somewhat influenced by America First populism, the way he kept talking about American jobs and made in America, and the Trump-type themes, which you never heard during the Obama years. It was heartening in some senses, but then, of course, in the second half, he just descended into all the woke initiatives. And then what was particularly offensive to me, not that I'm not used to it, is the attempt to again make it seem like Republicans are just on the verge of taking away your Social Security, your Medicare, and everything else. We've been hearing this message from the left literally for decades. And so we heard it again. So it's just a typical left-wing speech, but it did lay out the basic contours of his re-election campaign, which I expect he will kick off in a matter of days, if not a few weeks.
Okay, Tim, so you talked about themes there and contours, but for me, it didn't seem that there was a unifying theme, or as Einstein might put it, a grand unified theory. Graham, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the talk of unification coming from Joe Biden is just crazy anyway, because we know that it's only going to be a matter of days or weeks at the most before he is delivering an address somewhere else at some perhaps campaign stop or some conference or wherever. And he's going to start talking about the threats posed by MAGA Republicans once again, and the fact that we, and I say when I say we, I mean those of us who are on the political right, so to speak, that we're all a bunch of dangerous extremists who are hell-bent on destroying the country. So, it's kind of like Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables moment. When she made that comment, I knew right there and then that she had just sunk any chance she had whatsoever of winning the 2016 election, because you can't talk about unity but then literally admit that you hate half the country. And Joe Biden has already done this on multiple occasions. So any talk of unity, and I will add that he often frames unity because he is a career politician and he spent 17 or 18 decades in the Senate. It certainly felt like it.
He laid the foundational stone of that building on his first day.
He did, right? But I think it was the Roman Senate that he began with.
Yeah.
But anyway, when he describes unity, he frames it in terms of legislative achievement. He always talks about, his idea of unity is, well, Democrats and Republicans in the Congress are working together. But of course, even that's nonsense, because if you get a bill that the Democrats passed with maybe 2 or 3 Republican votes, he will call that a bipartisan bill, just the same way that they called the January 6th committee a bipartisan committee when, the Democrats literally dictated which 2 Republicans would be on that committee. And they were both certainly not, they were partisan themselves. So the nonsense, so unity, bipartisanship, this is all, it's all a mirage.
I think Scott, our resident legal scholar, would point out to us, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if you had 2 people about to appear on a jury, for example, as you did on the January 6th committee, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, names I thought I may never have to mention again, they would be struck from the jury, wouldn't they, Scott?
Well, I was thinking that you only need, actually, Graham gave it too much credit with 2 or 3 Republicans to make it bipartisan. You only need the one.
Yeah,
that's when it becomes bipartisan. And yeah, of course, Mark. But let's not. I think I've yelled at you before about this. That committee has as much in common with an actual criminal trial as a pineapple. I mean, they are not alike at all.
They all wear shoes outdoor. Now, come on, let's talk about the State of the Union here. There was quite a bit of to and fro.
I didn't even get a chance to give my 2 cents, which is I'm so disappointed in my colleagues for their cynicism. We had a president stand up to the drug companies, let us know that America could do no wrong when we work together, and there is no collection of Americans that some other collection of Americans can't steal from to better their lot. And I, for one, say, let's get to work.
Let's get to work. Yeah, I mean, the taxpayer has truly had a very busy year spending all of these trillions of dollars. That's trillion with 12 zeros, as Tim Donner likes to point out. Scott, I do have a question for you. And it was really about the to and fro that occurred during the speech, especially with some of the more raucous Republicans.
Interesting, huh? Yeah.
Now, here's the thing, right? I'm from the UK, and we're quite used to seeing adversarial politics, as in, one side will shout at the other, even when they're in the middle of a speech, and they'll start trying to make a point or make an argument. And I'm quite used to it. It's not as bad as the Australian Parliament, where obviously fistfights and whatnot yet. But there's a reason it's 2 sword lengths apart for the Westminster House of Parliament. But it seems that the media is quite a bit in shock now, doesn't it, Scott? At this a pearl-clutching shock, I might add, at the behavior of some of the Republicans. What's your take?
Well, of course, my take is that if you process their comments as they are Democrat operatives with bylines, they'll make more sense than if they were just reporters. But there did seem to be a bit more interaction than usual last night, I'll say, and Biden seemed to be more interested in engaging with that interaction.
Yes.
But I think that, as I recall, State of the Unions passed in my lifetime that I consumed as they were occurring, there's usually a once or maybe twice where there's a bit of a flippant comment that could be made by the president reacting to what's happening in the chamber. But it went on for more than usual last night, and there were more instances of it, I think.
Yeah, but it's for some people, I think it may have came across as a grumpy old man who can't let an insult slide. I don't know. That was just my take on it.
I can't imagine, by the way Biden just yells at everybody and how that's good speech making. I literally was watching and just kept thinking, how is this a good? To me, it makes the case that speech making is not an important part of being president of the United States or winning that office, because how can that be good?
Well, I would just ask if I could ask for
Please.
one thing from Joe Biden. It would be for him and his fellow leftists to define precisely what fair share is. They keep going, everybody needs to pay their fair share, which is the most demagogic political point you can make, and they keep using it. They never define it. How about it, Mr. President? What's a fair share? Tell us.
That is a great question to ask, and one that Thomas Sowell himself asked. What is a fair share of your money to give to somebody else? But I think Tim Donner put it better. Now, we're talking State of the Union with our special Liberty Nation panel. After this short break, we'll be back picking out the high points and the low points. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with our special Liberty Nation Radio State of the Union panel of Tim Donner, Graham J. Noble, and Scott D. Cosenza. Now, earlier we talked about the lack of a unifying theme to Biden's address. And next up, I really want to get your highs and your lows of the whole event. Now, for me, the high point, it was actually reading the speech as it was released on the White House official website and comparing it to the reality of what came out of the president's mouth. And if you have a spare couple of hours, I recommend everybody tries it, because it's quite the stark difference. And of course, you have the paper version that is now the official historical record. So referring to Chuck Schumer as the minority leader, as President Biden did in his first few minutes, when he has the teleprompter words in front of him, that now goes the way of the memory hole. So that was the high point for me, reading through that. But I guess I'd have to say that was also the low point, because historical revisionism, we don't like it. It's in 100 years, people will be studying the speech and not realize that Joe Biden can barely string a sentence together. Graham, what about you?
Well, the low point began when he started speaking, and it ended when he finished speaking. I thought of particular interest was the fact that he actually went off script, literally went out of his way to express his admiration for Chinese President Xi Jinping. That, to me, that was incredible, where, that had no place in that speech. And the fact that he went off script to do that, basically making the comment something along the lines of, who else would want Xi Jinping's job? As if to say, this guy has got the toughest job in the world, and thank the Lord he's there doing it. It's kind of a very, very strange to me. Other low points, of course, were his touting of certain economic achievements, which were, if you look at them in the correct context, they were all nonsense. I mean, the record job creation and the inflation coming down, despite that, inflation peaked at a horrendous number, of something like north of 9% last year, and it's
still 4 points up on where it was when he took office.
And yet he's lauding the fact that inflation come down, and of course, again, the whole deficit reduction again. I mean, we could get into the weeds of the numbers, but basically, that whole record deficit reduction is also nonsense, because essentially, in all of these areas, we're doing nothing more than returning to pre-pandemic levels. And in many cases, we're not even there at those levels yet.
I think another way of looking at pre-pandemic levels is to say Trump era levels, isn't it? Would that be a fair assessment?
Indeed, yes, exactly. Yes.
How about 2019 levels?
Yeah, just prior to the actual pandemic. Now, Scott, what's your highs and lows?
Well, those, by the way, in terms of pre-pandemic stuff, I just want to put this out there. We haven't even fixed these supply chain things that have gone on. I had to put half and half in my coffee today, like some kind of war refugee or something like that. I know.
You heathen.
How horrible.
This is the kind of thing we're dealing with here.
That's
Here in the
unconscionable.
States. By the way, I just wanted to say,
I'll get on the phone to Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Graham, your take on the Xi comment. But the thing I thought that I took away completely different take than you did, Graham, and I just wanted to bring it up because I think it's an interesting point. To me, Biden seemed to be saying we have so owned China that nobody wants to be president of China because that's how awesome we are in crushing China. That's what I took away from it. And but by the way, I also thought, like you did, it was a staggering divergence for what purpose? Like we're dunking, like to me, it was like we're dunking on China. Is this because of this balloon thing? I mean, that was just the nuts of it. But I'll get to Mark's question, which is the high points and the low points. I thought the high point was that he didn't use the State of the Union address to dump on and direct hate towards the roughly half of Americans who voted for somebody else to be president of the United States, that he didn't talk about Donald Trump or Republicans in a hateful way. At least I didn't pick up on it in any meaningful way that I've seen him do so many times before. I had a conversation before the speech with a relative of mine who will go nameless, who said, gee, I just wish that we could do without all the, the vitriol. And I almost, exploded because this person, voted for Biden. And of course, that's where so much vitriol had been coming from. So I think it's a real high point that he didn't do that. I don't know that there's any good moral reason, behind it, except it probably isn't polling very well. But that was the high point, I thought. And I thought the low point was for him to exploit the death of Tyree Nichols for applause and discuss like the need for change when he literally has done nothing as president of the United States now for a year to stop what he can do. I mean, he can direct the Department of Justice to prosecute local police departments who violate the civil rights of their citizens. We're chasing down and prosecuting people, who sat in Nancy Pelosi's chair for 3 minutes like they're actual terrorists. So that was the low for me.
Okay, and Tim.
Well, I thought for me, actually, the high point was the drama surrounding whether Kevin McCarthy was going to fall asleep. If you looked at him, he was getting sleepier and sleepier, and at one point, his eyes shut for an instant. So I thought there was very high drama there.
Tim, that was just a delicate homage to President Biden whenever he has to sit through anybody else speaking.
That's an excellent interpretation, Mark. The pandemic, the way, I don't know if any of you caught this, but did you see how he tried to blame the bloody violence of 2020 on the pandemic instead of on the cultural Marxists?
I didn't pick up on that.
That his party said, listen, it was a very nuanced thing, but he tried to write it off as part of the pandemic. The disingenuousness of his concern about fentanyl when he has overturned dozens of Trump regulations that have opened up the border and allowed records amount to come through. And he tries to act like they're really on it when they're not.
Coming up after this short break, we'll be reunited with our special Liberty Nation panel to discuss the political realities for Biden's speech and how it bodes for Biden's 2024 prospects. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Tim Donner, Graham J. Noble, and Scott D. Cosenza discussing the ins and outs of President Biden's State of the Union address. Now, earlier in the show, we talked the highs and lows and whether there was an identifiable theme. But now I want to get into the nitty-gritty of it and figure out just what political realities lie below the laundry list of the hot topics delivered to Congress. Now, Scott, there were a number of policies, or perhaps more accurately, wish list items in the address. Now, surely he knows that things like a federal abortion law and the like, these kind of things won't get passed with the GOP House. So what's the motivation?
Well, I can only assume the motivation is to virtue signal to people who want abortion to be legal and will vote for somebody based on that status alone, that they should vote for him. It's so funny, too. They don't even use the word abortion. As I recall during the speech, it was enshrine the protections of Roe v. Wade, enforce it. And of course, Roe v. Wade is a Supreme Court precedent that has since been overturned. And Congress cannot, like, the very language of it is preposterous. Congress can't enshrine Roe v. Wade into law. Roe v. Wade is a decision by the Supreme Court that says the Constitution means X, Y, and Z. That's not how Congress operates. They can pass a federal law, even if they did pass a federal law giving people the rights that the Supreme Court said were constitutional in Roe v. Wade. It wouldn't be enshrining Roe v. Wade into law. It's a separate mechanism. And maybe it's because I'm a lawyer who focuses on constitutional issues, but it does drive me batty that this is the way that the conversation is circled in on. But to answer your question, I'm sure it's a virtue signal and an attempt to gain, political support for his candidacy moving forward.
Graham, same question for you, but also I want your thoughts on the GOP reaction.
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, in reference to that particular question, of course, the wish list, if you like, of future legislative policy goals and so on is all about saying to people, look, when the election rolls around in 2024, not only do you have to re-elect me, but you need to give the Democrats control. You need to put the Democrats back in charge in the House of Representatives so that we can get these things done. So that's what it's all about to me. In terms of the GOP rebuttal, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, now governor of Arkansas, delivered that. And of course, the one thing that jumped out at everybody was that she said, this is not a question of a choice between right and left anymore. It's a question. It's a question of, but it's choosing between normal and crazy. And she's taken a lot of flack for that. I happen to agree with her because I like to sometimes just step away from the party politics of it, the D's and R's after people's names, and say, look, we've got a situation now where, in truth, most of the people in this country, or certainly I believe, and I would put money on it, most of the people in this country want normal. They want, we might have little differences of opinion of how we say provide healthcare services or how we do this, how we do that, how much government intervention should there be in the economy. We can differ over those things, but still most people in this country, regardless of what party they vote for, I believe want a sense of normality. And then you've got this other faction, which is being pandered to by the Democratic Party and specifically by Mr. Biden, who actually want crazy.
Okay, Tim, what about you?
Well, I think another key distinction that Sarah Sanders drew in her Republican response, which I thought was overall very impressive. I think she's got quite a future. And she pointed to the future in basically what I call the 40-80 construct. She said, I'm 40 years old, the youngest governor in the United States. Joe Biden is 80, the oldest man ever to serve in the presidency. So she's trying to create an image of Republicans as being more youthful than Democrats, that they're the ones with more of the normal ideas, as Graham was talking about. And clearly, Sarah Sanders, who proved herself, of course, as press secretary and an excellent one, as Kayleigh McEnany was for Donald Trump, they were both very effective. She got home the message using the key language, mincing no words, using words like woke mob, and not going quite as far as what Graham said, but saying that the left refuses to even define what a woman is. This is where we've reached the point of absurdity, where the line of acceptable discourse and acceptable ideas, the Overton window, so to speak, they're pulling it further and further towards crazy and trying to represent it as being normal.
Okay, so obviously, I think many people would agree that there is definitely a shift in the Overton window. I mean, we see it in what I guess a lot of people also say there's no such thing as cancel culture, which to those with eyes, ears, and computers know that that's not quite true. So the final thoughts on this is Karine Jean-Pierre, the present White House press secretary. Oh, and by the way, Tim, I noticed when you enumerated President Trump's great press secretaries, you didn't mention Sean Spicer. Does he not fit the bill of a great press secretary for you?
I think he was a bit dazed and confused, is what I would say. But I will say, for the sake of bipartisanship, that I thought Jen Psaki was also an effective press secretary for Joe Biden. Yeah.
Yeah, and Sean Spicer, hell of a dancer.
I would agree. Actually, she was far more professional, and look, you can argue all day about whether Jen Psaki was basically, let's say, being often disingenuous in terms of the answers she gave, but nevertheless, she presented an air of professionalism and competence. She actually seemed to be qualified to do that job.
So my final question, though, she said just before the State of the Union that this was Joe Biden's writing, that we would see Joe Biden in these words that were about to be presented. Who bought that? We have cricket and tumbleweed on the idea that Joe Biden actually wrote a single word of that presentation that he made before Congress.
I think it's pretty clear that he spent most of the, 60 weekends he's been away from the White House, scribbling away with notes on the State of the Union and what he was going to do, and changing and scratching out, being right on top of it. I'm sure that.
You want this guy to spend more time at the White House, Tim?
Yes.
60 weekends is light.
I wasn't complaining.
Oh, okay.
The edits and the revisions were very easy because obviously he was doing it on an Etch-a-Sketch, possibly with crayons. So, gentlemen, we will be back shortly after this short break, tackling how all this worked out as a 2024 launch pad for President Biden. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on Liberty Nation Radio with our distinguished panel of longtime host of this here show and senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, legal affairs editor, Scott DeCosenza, and chief political correspondent and satirist, Mr. Graham J. Noble. Now, in our earlier segments, we ran the gamut on the State of the Union and what it represented. But now I'd like to turn to what it means for Joe Biden and his 2024 prospects. Now, Tim, as of our recording time, Joe Biden has yet to officially announce his 2024 plans, although a lot of hints have been dropped. And you wrote an article on the pages of libertynation.com explaining how the State of the Union would set the stage for Biden's electoral hopes. Now that the event is in the rear view, what's your take? Have you changed your opinion or no?
Well, I think that he's going to try to do a two-track appeal like he did during the State of the Union. On the one hand, he's going to be really pro-American. He's going to sound almost America first, make sure manufacturing jobs stay here, that all the money in the infrastructure bill will be spent on American firms, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll try to claim that he's a populist in that sense. And again, I see the Trump influence there as perverse as some people might think that to be. But on the other hand, he's going to say that he has saved the country from the extremism of Trump, DeSantis, and company. He didn't go after them in this State of the Union so much. But here's what he did do. He tied the January 6th insurrection. Again, if you were really paying attention, he tied the January 6th insurrection to the attack on Paul Pelosi. Yeah. So that was his
same
way.
paragraph as well.
The same sentence.
They were using the same words, he said.
Using the same words.
Attacker, like he was inspired directly.
Right.
The
two words were, "Where's Nancy?" Like, how many times in the history of Nancy Pelosi's to Janarian life as somebody said, "Where's Nancy?" Okay.
Sure, Tim, maybe plenty, but they were all racists, of course.
So he's going to save the country, Joe Biden says, from these extremists and try to, he'll talk unity and he will run as a divider like he did in 2020. And the press will call him a unity candidate. They'll call DeSantis or Trump or Youngkin or whoever else gets the nomination as a divider and an extremist and someone who, Joe Biden himself demonized half the country, as we've discussed during his administration. That should be brought up heavily by whoever the Republican nominee is. But he will continue on this theme for one particular reason, will the president, and that is that he has elite media behind him all the way to the end. He had it in 2020, and he'll have it again in 2024, which means he'll be more effective at getting the public to buy what he's trying to sell than he would ordinarily. But let's not forget, he has been stubbornly stuck at 44% approval, Joe Biden, for a long time now. Actually, a remarkably stable job approval number. 44% is not a reelect number. Presidents do not get reelected with 44% approval. So he's going to have to amp that up. He really hasn't hit any higher than 46. And at one point, of course, he was in the 30s. So that's an indicator that, he's going to need a lot more fuel for the engine if he's going to win a second term.
Yeah, I think it was only Harry Truman who managed to pull off getting elected with the low 40s. But that required an enormous amount of energy traversing the country back and forth in the last
I don't see Joe Biden on a continental whistle stop trip like Harry Truman in 1948.
It's unlikely. I mean, I believe that Joe Biden was with him during that trip in his first years in Congress.
He was one of his senior advisors, I think.
Yeah. Again, also to Julius Caesar. Now, Graham, do you think anybody was swayed by what Biden said? And I'm talking specifically with a lens to 2024. I mean, there's a significant number of Democrats who don't want him to run again, but they'll still check the box mark Democrat if he is the nominee. But do you think he has used this opportunity, because the State of the Union is an opportunity, to help or hinder his chances with the all-important independence?
No, I don't believe so at all. And specifically for independence, I can't imagine how anything he said last night would have swayed anyone who has been paying attention, because we've heard this all before. The touting of the records, job creation, which is actually a complete mirage, and inflation coming down, which in real terms is not. I mean, it is happening now, but of course it's only coming down from a horrendous spike. It's not actually lower than it was, before Mr. Biden came to office. And so all of those phony and a lot of independents, that's what they're looking at. They're looking at the economy. They're looking at their paychecks. They're looking at how much they're paying in taxes and what they can afford, what they can and cannot afford to do, and throwing out these phony accomplishments, economic accomplishments of the Biden administration is not swaying any independent who's paying attention. And as for the Democrats who perhaps don't want Joe Biden to run for another term, and I personally believe there's a very good chance that is actually most Democrats. I don't just mean among the voters, but I mean actually among current elected officials in the Democratic Party. I can't believe for a second that most of them actually are enthusiastic about Biden running for a second term. But of course, what do they do about that? They're really between a rock and a hard place on that. But yeah, I mean, coming back to the question, did the address itself sway anybody who was perhaps not on board with the Biden platform? No, I can't imagine why it would have done that.
Okay. And Scott, what do you think the DNC folks are ruminating on right now? Are they patting themselves on the back for a job well done by Joe Biden, saying he's our man for 2024?
If they're the DNC folks that are the Biden people at the DNC, then they're ready to put poison
Who are
in
the
drink
other
of
folks?
of their colleagues that are rooting for some other candidate. So it is blood sport in there, to be sure. There's no unity. I can guarantee you that.
Do you think we'll see an internecine warfare?
We've
situation?
seen it. It's happening now. I mean, the kind of barbs that have come out against Biden for the classified document story, for instance, to me show a willingness by these reporters who are, by and large, Democrat influenced people or Democrat influencers, that they're giving permission to basically think bad things about Joe Biden. That to me is a big deal.
Absolutely. Now, Tim, final question goes to you. What should Joe Biden be aiming to do differently in his 2023 address, assuming that Kamala Harris hasn't usurped the throne?
Well, I would expect him to be probably a little more divisive than this year and talk more about the democracy is at stake and all that exaggerated rhetoric like he used at that, with the blood red backdrop at Independence Hall on July 4th. I mean, that was just so over the top, and I think people were affronted by that. But I think he feels like he has to do that because, look, there's not a person in this country except perhaps Dr. Jill Biden who is enthused about having Joe Biden as president.
Hunter, Tim.
Hunter, yes. Well, I'm not so sure about that either.
Hunter's hoping that Joe becomes emperor.
I don't think there would be an investigation if Hunter was just some former vice president's kid. But, nobody's enthusiastic about him. And he himself admitted he's just a placeholder. He's a generic Democrat. He's not Trump, not DeSantis, not Youngkin, not Haley, not Cruz, et cetera, and all those Republican hopefuls. And I think he's going to fall back on what he did in 2020, which is to simply be not the other guy and count on the media to put the wind at his back and somehow push him into the Oval Office for a second term, after which he would be 86 years old. Count him, 86.
That's with 12 zeros, Tim.
I know I'm going to be called ageist for that, but as a seasoned citizen myself, I get the right to say that.
Absolutely. Tim Donner, thank you very much. Scott Cosenza, thank you very much. And Graham Noble, thank you very much. And that's all we have time for on this special edition of Liberty Nation Radio, State of the Union Dissection here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our panel, Tim Donner, Graham Noble, and Scott Cosenza, for joining us. Give my appreciation to you, the listeners out there who take the time to join the fun. My parting shot for this week, I want to take a brief moment to discuss advertising. For the State of the Union address is truly a public advertisement to sell an agenda and create user buy-in for the things to come. As Noam Chomsky remarked, it's important to bear in mind that political campaigns are designed by the same people who sell toothpaste and cars. And he's not far wrong. The public is sold on the features and benefits of an administration, but also something darker. We should perhaps take to heart the words of George Orwell in his essay, Why I Write. He said, "All the papers that matter live off their advertisements, and the advertisers exercise an indirect censorship over news." Well, if that's true for papers, why would it not be the same for political advertisement? Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five.